hated by her family, chosen by a war hero before the king. When love speaks louder than fear. Rain fell on the roof like the sky was crying for her. Olivia sat by the window, knees pulled to her chest, forehead pressed to the cold glass. She was only 6, but she already understood silence better than most grown women. It was in the way the servants passed her in the halls, eyes averted. It was in how the Duke, her father, though he never called himself that, never once looked her in the eye. And it was in the way the entire house went still when she entered a room, as if her presence was a stain that couldn't be scrubbed out. Olivia was the illegitimate daughter of Duke Raventhorn, born of a fleeting affair he had never planned to acknowledge. But when her mother died suddenly of fever, a letter had been delivered to his estate, her final plea to not let their child grow up in the streets. He had relented, reluctantly. She arrived at the estate with nothing but a worn-out doll and a pair of shoes 2 sizes too small. The staff took her in, cleaned her up, and gave her a room so far from the main hall it could have been a broom closet. But that was all. No hugs, no warm welcomes, no family. The Duchess, tall and graceful with eyes like sharpened crystal, had stared at her for a long moment. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She only asked, in a quiet voice, "Is this the child?" The Duke nodded once, and then, without another word, the Duchess turned and walked away. Olivia learned quickly that she was not meant to be seen, only tolerated. Her meals were placed at a separate table in the kitchen. Her clothes were hand-me-downs from long-forgotten cousins, and no one, absolutely no one, called her by name. Just the girl. But still, she was a child. She cried sometimes. She missed her mother. She asked questions that no one answered. She wandered into the wrong rooms and got scolded for it. And when bruises began to bloom on her arms, and her ribs became visible beneath her blouse, it wasn't her father who noticed. It was the Duchess. One morning, Olivia collapsed in the garden. She hadn't eaten properly in days. Her small hands trembled as she tried to hold a watering can, and then everything turned black. When she awoke, it wasn't in the cold, narrow cot she knew. It was in a warm bed, clean sheets, a soft pillow. And the Duchess, sitting beside her with a bowl of soup. "You're burning up," she said gently, brushing Olivia's hair back from her damp forehead. "When was the last time you had a proper meal?" Olivia blinked at her, not understanding the question. From that day on, something changed. The Duchess began to check on her. First in small ways, making sure she ate, giving her a new dress, brushing her tangled hair without pulling. Then larger things followed. A tutor was assigned to help her read. A nurse was told to examine her bruises. And slowly, cautiously, Olivia began to bloom under her care. She laughed for the first time in months when the Duchess brought her a ribbon the color of sunshine. "Try it on," she said with a smile. "It suits you." It did. More than that, Olivia began to bond with the Duchess's children, her half-siblings. Her younger sister, Clara, was only 5 and adored Olivia instantly. They would sit in the library, whispering about fairy tales and drawing pictures of dragons. Her older brother Edric was 10 and aloof, but even he couldn't completely ignore her when Clara insisted they all play together. For the first time since her mother's death, Olivia felt like maybe this could be a family. But happiness, she would learn, was fragile. One evening, a storm brewed over the estate. Thunder cracked like the sky itself was splitting. Inside the manor, the Duke's voice could be heard rising in fury. "She is not your daughter," he bellowed. "She is a child and she is suffering," the Duchess answered, voice steady but trembling. "If you cannot see that, you are not fit to call yourself a father." They argued for hours. Olivia heard every word from the top of the stairs, her little hands clutching the banister like it could hold her together. By morning, the Duchess was gone, sent away to the family's summer estate. To rest, the Duke said, but she never arrived. The carriage never made it past the cliffs. The storm had turned the road to mud, and the horses had slipped. They said the fall was quick, that she didn't feel a thing. Olivia was only 7. but she would never forget the way the manor changed overnight. The staff who once softened beneath the Duchess's gaze now turned harsh again. Clara was pulled away from her. For her own good. Edric stopped looking at her entirely. The Duke, cold before, became ice, and the whispers returned. She's the reason the Duchess died. She cursed the family. If only she'd never come here. Olivia didn't cry. She didn't argue. She simply learned once more how to vanish. But now, she knew something she hadn't known before. Kindness existed, and someone, even for a brief, precious moment, had chosen her. Even if the world would never forgive her for it. The years that followed were painted in shades of gray. Olivia was not sent away. That would have drawn too much attention. Instead, she was made invisible. The staff was instructed to treat her with courtesy, but not warmth. Her name was never spoken aloud. The Duchess's portrait remained in the Great Hall, but no one dared speak of the reason she'd been on that fatal road. Everyone knew, and no one said it. But Olivia heard it in their footsteps when they passed her room. She saw it in the way they turned their backs at dinner. She felt it in the way even the tapestries seemed to hush when she walked by. By the time she turned 8, she had learned how to never speak first. By 9, she had learned to eat quickly, silently, so no one would scold her for lingering too long at a table that was never set for her. By 10, she had stopped hoping for kindness altogether. Clara, her younger sister, was the only one who held on. The fragile girl, born with a weak heart and soft eyes, never knew the full story. The Duke had hidden the details from her, fearing the stress would worsen her condition. So Clara, oblivious to the whispered blame, still clung to Olivia like a shadow of childhood that hadn't yet been stolen. In those rare, quiet hours, when Clara's hand found Olivia's in the garden, or when they shared a book by candlelight, it felt like nothing had changed. But the spell would always break when a maid stepped in and pulled Clara away, too harshly, too quickly. "Don't tire yourself, my lady," they'd say. "You shouldn't be near her for too long." As if Olivia were illness itself. Her brother Edric had once called her a walking regret. He didn't say it to her face. He said it to a friend one day when he thought she was out of earshot. But she heard. She always heard. He had once held her hand when they snuck out to chase fireflies. Now he wouldn't so much as look at her. His mother was gone, and Olivia was the ghost that haunted what was left of her. The Duke? He was worse than silent. He was distant, indifferent. There were moments when Olivia caught him staring at her, long and unblinking, as though trying to make sense of something that no longer fit in his world. Perhaps guilt, perhaps disgust. She would never know. He never spoke to her directly unless absolutely necessary, and even then his words were clipped like orders from a stranger. By the time she reached 10, Olivia had grown tired of crying. Tears were for the hopeful. She wasn't hopeful anymore. So when a letter arrived from the palace, sealed in gold wax and carried by a royal courier, offering her hand in marriage to the crown prince, she did not react the way most young girls would. She did not scream with joy. She did not ask what dress she would wear. She did not dream of dancing in a ballroom or wearing a tiara. She only asked in a quiet voice, "Do I have a choice?" The Duke looked at her for the first time in weeks. "No," he said, and that was that. The engagement was formalized in cold ink on parchment, a distant, politically convenient match. Olivia, a noble by blood but forgotten by status, was to be wed to the Crown Prince of Irondale, a man 5 years her senior who had no affection for her, no interest in anything beyond his own ambitions, and certainly no intention of offering her the life her title now implied. She met him only a few times before the war, always in formal settings, always with stiff conversation and cold smiles. He called her my future duty once in jest, to the laughter of his guards. Olivia only bowed her head and said nothing. When she was 12, she began receiving her allowance as a noble fiancé, a monthly sum, generous on paper, meant to prepare her for palace life. She saved it all. Every coin, every scrap, not for herself, but for Edric. He had joined the royal army at 17, already a decorated student of strategy and swordsmanship. When the war broke out, he was appointed as commander of a southern division. The Duke was proud, Clara cried. And Olivia? She sent provisions, not under her name, of course. He would have refused them, as he had every letter she had tried to send over the years, so she signed them as Sunny, a name from a bedtime story the Duchess once read to her. A name Clara had whispered into her hair when Olivia cried at night. A name no one would trace to the girl no one claimed. She sent blankets, dried fruit, spices, poultices for burns, ink and paper, even a stitched handkerchief with no name on it. With each parcel, she wrote a letter, never too personal, always full of strength, of hope, of light. "You do not walk alone," she wrote once. "This world is cruel, but you are braver than the cruelty it throws at you." She never knew if he read them. What she didn't know, what no one could have guessed, was that her letters were being passed around, not among her brother's troops, but to a different man altogether, a general, a warrior, a war hero, the Grand Duke of Vikander. Wounded in the early battles and stationed at the edge of the front lines, he received a crate of supplies by mistake. One meant for Edric, misrouted by a young courier. He opened it, curious. Inside, balm for burns, salves for wounds, a thick scarf, and a letter signed only as Sunny. He read the letter once, then twice. Then, in the dark of his tent, while men around him screamed in their sleep, he read it again. He smiled. Not because the war was any less hellish, but because somewhere, someone still believed in kindness, and he clung to that like a soldier clings to breath. In the stillness of a tent that smelled of ash and iron, the Grand Duke of Vikander read Olivia's words once more. He had seen hundreds of letters, cries for sons to return, noble praises from generals, reports from the capital, but this was different. The handwriting was careful, almost hesitant, as if the writer had been taught formality, but never praised for beauty. The ink was faint in places, the grammar modest. But the words burned. They were soft, brave, honest in a way people were rarely honest anymore. You do not walk alone. Even the wounded carry light. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to bow to it. Sunny. He folded the letter carefully, like something sacred. The next day, he instructed his manservant to ask around. Who was this Sunny? Was she a soldier's sweetheart? A noble's daughter? A nurse? No one could say. The parcels continued to arrive, every few weeks, accompanied by another quiet letter, and the Grand Duke continued to read them in silence, keeping them tucked in his breast pocket like a shield no steel could match. He began writing back. At first, he wrote only in his mind. He composed answers while riding through smoke, imagined her voice while walking between the wounded. But eventually, he gave in. The letter was short. To the one who signs the sun, your words are an anchor. I do not know who you are, but I am better for having read your thoughts. The world is darker than we expected, but perhaps not lost. Thank you. He did not sign his name. He sealed it with a wax imprint of the Vikander crest, a sword flanked by roses, and included it in the next package sent to the southern lines. It never reached Edric. Instead, it found its way back to Olivia's room, bundled at the bottom of the delivery crate like a forgotten scrap. She nearly tossed it with the straw, but the wax caught her eye. Her breath stopped. It couldn't be. She opened it with trembling fingers, read the lines once, twice, and again. Whoever he was, he had read her words. He had answered. A laugh, small and disbelieving, slipped past her lips. Her first in weeks. For the first time since she could remember, someone had seen her. Not as the illegitimate daughter of a dead duchess or the unwanted bride of a prince, but as something worth replying to. She wrote again. This time, her words were still careful, still unsigned, but there was more of her in them. Not just platitudes or encouragements. She shared memories of growing up in shadows, of loving the stars because they never turned their backs, of tending to bruises no one else saw. The Grand Duke read it in silence, fingers tightening around the paper. She was young, too young to carry so much sorrow. But her spirit was made of steel. He wrote back again, and again, and again. What started as replies became conversations. He spoke of the war, not in tactics, but in weight, of what it meant to lead men to death, to survive when better men did not. He never shared his name, but Olivia sensed something noble in his words, something deeply tired, something desperately needing to believe in goodness again. She wrote about Clara, and the sound of rain in the manor gardens, and the books she hid under her pillow. About the feeling of being too much and never enough, all at once. He never judged. He never pitied. He listened. They wrote through seasons. Winter frost hardened the fields. Spring melted the edges of grief. Letters became lifelines. Pages became sanctuaries. Words became confessions they dared not speak to anyone else. Neither asked for names. Neither offered them. It was safer that way. Until one day, a stormy spring afternoon when thunder cracked the sky above Vikander's camp, the Grand Duke received a supply crate addressed not to Sonny, but to Edric of House Thorn. He frowned. Thorn. He had heard that name. A noble family with deep ties to the royal court. He opened the crate. Everything was the same. Spices, medicines, parchment. But at the bottom was a folded piece of paper, hastily tucked beneath the linen. The handwriting. It was hers. He read the letter, and halfway through his blood chilled. She mentioned Clara. She mentioned a garden with marble statues. She mentioned a caged hawk that used to cry out at dawn. He had been to House Thorn once, years ago. As a guest of the Duke, he remembered the hawk. He remembered the statues. He remembered a small pale child in the background, carrying a tray too heavy for her arms. It couldn't be. The girl from those letters was Olivia? His throat tightened. He sent no letter that week. He sat in his tent, rereading every word she had written since that first message, every quiet strength, every brave sentence, every line that had carried him through blood and fire. Olivia. She had no idea who he was. And now, he knew who she was. The unwanted bride. The one they discarded. The one who had been traded like coin to the crown prince. Who had boasted of his duty wife and laughed at her name during court banquets. A rage he had not known he was capable of burned in his chest. She had loved in silence, given in secret, survived without praise. He thought of her, not in silk or gold, but with ink-stained fingers and sorrow in her eyes, giving light she had never been given. He knew what he had to do. The war was ending, and when it did, he would find her, not as a stranger in the street, not as a duke, but as a man who owed her more than he could ever repay. The war ended not with trumpets, but with silence. Smoke no longer curled above the distant hills. The cries of the wounded were replaced by the hum of rebuilding. People returned to their homes, some to joy, others to ruins. And in the capital, the palace gleamed brighter than ever, throwing banquets to distract from the ghosts still clinging to its walls. Olivia watched from the shadows, as always. She had not been invited to the celebration feast. She never was. Her fiancé, the crown prince, had returned in triumph but did not come to see her. The last time he had looked at her with anything other than annoyance was never, she realized. 14 years of betrothal. 14 years of being invisible to the man who held her future in his hands. She had long since stopped waiting for affection. Instead, she spent her days in the garden behind the palace wing, where the roses bloomed only out of habit. She spoke softly to Clara when her health allowed for visits and kept her distance from Edric, who barely acknowledged her presence except to reject her gestures of kindness. Still, she wrote letters. Still, she sent parcels, though fewer now. The one she waited for had stopped writing back, and that, more than anything, had made the world feel colder. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting gold over the palace gates, a knock echoed through the servants' wing. Olivia, barefoot and holding a cloth of fresh herbs for Clara, paused mid-step. The staff wasn't expecting visitors. And yet there he was, a tall man in a worn traveling coat, with broad shoulders and dark hair that curled slightly from the rain. His boots were dusted with dried mud, his expression unreadable. But his eyes were storm and fire and memory. "I'm here for Lady Olivia," he said simply, his voice deep but gentle. The guard blinked. "She's not receiving visitors. She will receive me." The guard hesitated, then turned, then, oddly, obeyed. A servant came running down the hall. "Lady Olivia," she said out of breath. There's a man asking for you, at the gate." Olivia felt a prickle of unease. No one ever came for her. She made her way through the corridor slowly, unsure of what waited beyond the doors. When she finally stepped out into the fading light, her breath caught in her throat. He looked familiar. But it wasn't until he stepped forward, pulled a small bundle of worn letters from his coat, and placed them in her hand that she knew. Her heart stopped. "You kept them," she whispered. "I read them," he replied. "Everyone." The realization bloomed inside her like spring after a long, cruel winter. "You're..." She couldn't finish the sentence. He nodded once. "Edric of Vikander, the Grand Duke." She swayed slightly. He caught her before she could fall. "I didn't know," she murmured. "I didn't..." "You weren't supposed to," he said. "But I know you. I've known your thoughts, your kindness, your pain. And I couldn't stay away any longer." The air between them buzzed with unsaid words. The kind of words no one had ever spoken to her. Not with sincerity. Not without wanting something in return. "I wanted to find you before the celebration," he said. "Before they could parade me around and ask what I'll wish for in front of the king." She blinked. "Wish?" "The king promised each war hero one reward. Anything within his power." "And what will you ask for?" He took a slow breath, like a man preparing to jump into deep water. "I will ask for you." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick with disbelief, with wonder, with terror. "You can't," she whispered. "I'm promised. To the Crown Prince. And I'm no one." "No," he said, stepping closer. "You are Olivia of House Thorn. You are the girl who carried this nation's spirit when it was crumbling. You are the reason soldiers kept fighting. You are not no one." Tears burned her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "You'll ruin your name. I'll build a better one. They'll mock you. They already do. They'll hate me." "Then let them," he said, voice fierce now. "Let them all burn with envy while I walk beside the only person who ever truly saw me." She was trembling. "I'm afraid," she confessed. "So am I," he said. "But courage, as you once wrote, is not the absence of fear. It's the refusal to bow to it." She laughed then, through the tears. A sound so soft, it felt like sunlight after years of rain. He took her hand, gently. "Come with me. You don't have to stay here. You don't have to wait for scraps of love anymore." She looked at the palace behind her, at the stone walls that had never protected her, at the family that had only ever used her, at the man inside who wore a crown and kept another woman in his bed. Then she looked at the stranger. No, not a stranger, who had carried her words through war, who had crossed the kingdom just to stand at her gate, who did not flinch at her scars. "Yes," she said quietly. He smiled, and just like that, Olivia took her first step out of the shadows, hand in hand with the man who would change everything. The morning after the war banquet dawned bright, the skies blissfully unaware that within the marble walls of the royal court, thunder had already struck. Whispers exploded before the trumpets had time to sound. The Grand Duke of Vikander, war hero, noble of unshakable reputation, the king's own champion, had used his royal reward to request the hand of Lady Olivia Thorne in marriage. Not a princess, not a duchess, not even a beloved daughter, but Olivia, the illegitimate girl cloaked in scandal, promised to the crown prince since she was 10, and despised by nearly everyone who bore her name. The throne room, filled only hours before with music and praise, now swirled with disbelief. The king had hesitated when the wish was spoken, but rules were rules, and he had promised each war hero a reward within his power. The Grand Duke's request, shocking as it was legitimate, and it cracked the court open like a rotten fruit. In the West Wing, the Crown Prince raged. "She was mine," he shouted, throwing a crystal glass against the hearth. "A tool for alliance, not—" "She's not an object," barked the king, unusually stern. "And she is not yours unless she consents to be. But she's my betrothed. Your betrothal was a convenience, nothing more. You've ignored her for years. I will not undo a hero's reward because you took her presence for granted." The prince turned red. "This is an insult." "No," the king said, standing slowly. "This is a reckoning." At House Thorn, chaos bloomed. The Duke, Olivia's estranged father, paced his study in stunned silence, while his eldest son, Edric, fumed beside him. "She's manipulating him. It's the only explanation," Edric muttered. "She doesn't have the skill to manipulate a man like Vikander," the Duke replied grimly. "This isn't her doing." "Then what? He just loves her." The word made the Duke's jaw tighten. "Perhaps he does. Or perhaps he's making a political move we can't yet see. Either way, she's no longer ours to manage. She's still bound to the royal house. The Crown Prince won't let this go." "No, and neither will we. At least, not yet." He moved to the window and stared at the gray sky. "Find out where she is. We must renegotiate." But Olivia was no longer in the palace. The moment the Grand Duke made his wish, she was quietly escorted to the Vikander estate under heavy protection. Not as a prisoner, but as a guest, and more importantly, as someone whose life had just become priceless. It was the safest she had felt in years. Still, it didn't stop her from shaking when she sat beside the Grand Duke in the carriage. "I didn't think you'd do it," she whispered. "I didn't think I'd say it aloud either," he confessed. "But once the words left my mouth, I knew I couldn't take them back, nor would I want to." "They'll come after you," she said. "They already are. And after me." He looked at her then, not with pity or caution, but with calm certainty. "Then let them come." Inside the Vikander estate, Olivia stepped into a world far removed from the marble coldness of the royal palace. The halls were lined with books instead of portraits. The servants bowed with warmth instead of wariness. The scent of pine and bread filled the air. No one called her that girl. No one averted their eyes. And yet, she struggled to believe any of it was real. That night she stood by the fire in a soft wool gown, borrowed but warm, and stared into the flames. "What do I do now?" she whispered. The Grand Duke entered quietly behind her. "You breathe." She turned, and after that, "You live." He sat beside her. "I don't know how," she admitted. "That's all right. I do." They sat in silence again, the firelight painting his features gold. "I was never going to ask for anything else," he said finally. "When the king offered us a wish, some asked for land, for gold, for titles. I asked for the only thing that mattered to me. Why? Because you believed in me when I wasn't a hero, when I was only a man bleeding in the dark, reading letters from someone who reminded me the world could still be gentle." Olivia's throat tightened. "I never knew my words mattered," she said. "They saved lives," he replied. "They saved mine." The court, however, refused to stay quiet. Lady Celestine called the match a betrayal. Housethorn demanded annulment of Olivia's engagement. The Crown Prince publicly questioned the Grand Duke's judgment. But for each insult thrown, there was a ripple of support. Commoners whispered about the girl who rose from the shadows. Young women in the market argued whether love could conquer politics. Even scholars wrote on the match, calling it the most honest union in a century. And Clara, sweet, gentle Clara, sent a letter. It arrived on Olivia's third morning at Vikander Hall. I don't know what they told me when I was a child, but I know now it wasn't the truth. I remember how you held my hand when I cried. I remember how you made up stories when I couldn't sleep. I remember you, Olivia, not the shadow they tried to paint. I'm sorry I forgot for a while, but I remember now. Tears blurred the ink. Olivia held the letter to her heart and breathed deeply. She was no longer the pawn. She was no longer the shameful secret. She was no longer the girl waiting in vain for someone to choose her. She had been chosen, and now, for the first time in her life, she was choosing herself too. The rain began before sunrise, not a quiet mist, but a downpour, furious and unrelenting, as if the skies above the capital mirrored the tension building within its walls. Word had spread like fire in dry grass. The Grand Duke would marry Lady Olivia Thorne, and no one could stop it. But that didn't mean they wouldn't try. In the royal palace, the Crown Prince paced like a caged animal. His pride had suffered a blow from which it would not easily recover. "She was mine," he snarled to his mother, the Queen. "A symbol, a convenience, and now she dares..." "She dares nothing," the Queen interrupted coolly, smoothing the lace at her wrists. She was nothing until he gave her meaning. That truth stung more than the betrayal. "I should have put her in a convent when she turned 15, he muttered. "She was useful," the Queen reminded him. "She was meant to secure obedience from House Thorne, now that usefulness has shifted to him." The Queen's gaze darkened. "And that's what makes this dangerous. Vikander has power beyond the battlefield now. He has loyalty, admiration, and now, sentiment. The people are watching. The court is divided." "Then divide it further," the prince hissed. "Make her fall. Tear her from that pedestal." In House Thorne, the mood was no calmer. The Duke sat stone-faced at the head of a long table, surrounded by advisors and his eldest son Edric, whose fury had not cooled. "She's destroying us," Edric spat. "Every letter that arrives from the nobles is colder than the last. They think we gave her to him." "We did not give anything," the Duke snapped. "We lost her. Like a fool loses a coin in the dark." "She was a mistake from the start," someone muttered. A younger advisor added, "You should issue a public statement. Condemn her. Distance yourself." But the Duke didn't answer right away. His eyes were on the fire, watching the wood crackle and fall in on itself. He remembered the moment he had brought Olivia into his house, not with joy, but with strategy. He'd thought she would be a shield for Clara, an excuse, a disposable piece. But now the piece had moved on its own, and worse, she'd become the queen of the board. Meanwhile, at Vikander Hall, Olivia read the morning's letter with trembling fingers. It had no signature, only 4 words written in elegant scrawl. "You will regret this." She folded the note carefully and placed it in the fire. "You're not afraid?" the Grand Duke asked from behind her. "I am," she admitted, watching the paper curl. "But I've lived in fear all my life. This time, I choose to fear something with meaning." He crossed the room in 3 steps and offered his hand. "Then stand beside me." "I already do." The people of the kingdom were split. In the alleys and bakeries, whispers turned into debates. Was she a gold digger or a girl of resilience? Was he blinded by affection or finally seeing truth? In the noble salons, eyes narrowed. Daughters were warned. Sons were reminded what was acceptable in a wife. But behind closed doors, even some noble mothers admitted, "She's not what they say." She held her dignity through shame. "She might not be one of us, but perhaps she is better." But not everyone softened. At the palace, the Crown Prince's retaliation took form. A royal summons was issued, demanding Olivia's presence at court. Officially, it was a request for clarification on her broken engagement. Unofficially, it was a trap. The Grand Duke read the parchment, then burned it before Olivia could see it. "They're calling me to defend myself, aren't they?" she asked anyway. He looked at her with quiet fire. You owe them nothing. But if I don't go, they'll say I'm hiding. If I do go, they'll tear me apart. You won't go alone. 3 days later, Olivia entered the royal palace not as a forgotten child of scandal, but as the intended of the Grand Duke. Her gown simple, her chin lifted, her silence louder than 1,000 titles. The nobles gathered like crows. The queen sat on her throne, face unreadable. The crown prince leaned against a marble pillar, arms crossed. You dare defy a royal union, he said, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. I defy no one, Olivia answered. You broke the bond when you abandoned it. He scoffed. You were a child. And yet I was promised, and discarded. You think yourself worthy of him? No, Olivia said. He does, and he knows me. The prince's lips curled in disdain. He knows the mask you wear. The Grand Duke stepped forward. I know her heart, and you never bothered to see it. A gasp rippled through the court, but it was the queen who spoke next. Let us not turn personal matters into public performance. The kingdom cannot afford division. The king rose slowly from his high seat. He had watched silently until now. She was yours to protect, he said to the prince, and you failed. She is now Vikander's to cherish, and he will not fail. He turned to Olivia. Do you accept the Grand Duke's proposal of your own will? Olivia looked into the crowd. She saw the faces that had shamed her, judged her, broken her. She saw her father, unmoved, her brother, cold, and Clara, watching, pale and wide-eyed. Then she turned to the Grand Duke. I do. Outside the court, the sky had cleared. The storm had passed, for now. But the tides were still shifting. Inside her chest, Olivia felt the weight of centuries fall from her shoulders. For once, she was not surviving someone else's decision. She had made her own. And the kingdom, whether ready or not, would have to learn the name Olivia Thorne not as a scandal, but as a woman impossible to erase. The celebration was unlike anything Olivia had ever seen. The palace grounds, once cold and distant, now shimmered with light. Hundreds gathered in the gardens of Vikander Hall for the betrothal banquet, not just nobles but commoners too. Soldiers who had fought beside the Grand Duke, seamstresses who had embroidered the royal banners, farmers who had given wheat to the war effort. They were there not out of duty but devotion. Olivia stood beside the Grand Duke under a flowering arch, the evening sun painting her skin gold. She wore no jewels but a single silver hairpin. She had refused the velvet gowns they offered, choosing a dress in soft blue linen, the same color she had worn the day he first truly saw her. He had asked her why. She had simply said, because I want to remember who I am, not who they expect me to become. And so she stood, unadorned, unafraid, but not untouched by fear. Because the cost of choosing love was never small. That night, Clara arrived. She stood at the gate in a cloak too large for her and eyes too old for her 16 years. A guard recognized her and hesitated before sending a message inside. Olivia received it with trembling hands. She hadn't seen Clara in months, not since the day the truth about their mother had shattered what little warmth still tied them. I need to see her, Olivia said. The Grand Duke seated beside her gave a slow nod. Go. Outside, under the glow of lanterns swaying in the wind, the two sisters met like strangers. Clara spoke first. You're thinner, she murmured. So are you. A long silence. Then Clara looked away, eyes brimming. I heard what they say about the Grand Duke, that he loves you, that you saved lives during the war. I did what I could, Olivia said. And the Crown Prince? You never loved him? I was never given the chance to love anyone freely. Clara blinked at that. And now you are? Olivia nodded. Now I am. Clara took a step closer. Then, why do you still look like it hurts? Olivia's breath caught. Because it did hurt. It hurt to know the people she had once called family had only ever seen her as a problem to be solved, a burden to pass off. It hurt to think that even her brightest memories, laughing in the garden with Clara, helping the maids braid ribbons, had all been built on borrowed time. And it hurt to see Clara now, standing on the edge between sister and stranger. Because love doesn't erase what came before, Olivia said softly. It just makes surviving it worth something. Inside, the music swelled. Outside, Clara whispered, "Father is furious. Edric too. They say you're a traitor." "I was never theirs to begin with," Olivia replied. Clara hesitated. Then, with trembling hands, she reached into her cloak and pulled out a crumpled letter. "I found this," she said, "in Edric's study." Olivia unfolded it. Her fingers went cold. It was an unsigned message, written in shorthand, the kind used by House Thorne's secretaries. But the meaning was clear. If she becomes a Vikander, the archives must be purged. The fire must be blamed on an accident. Do not let her find the records. Clara's voice broke. "I think they're going to destroy something. Something important." Olivia folded the paper slowly. "What kind of records?" Clara shook her head. "I don't know, but they said your name, over and over." That night, long after the guests had gone, Olivia sat alone in the Grand Duke's library, the letter clenched in her hands. He entered without knocking, as always. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said gently. "I think I've just seen the shadow it left behind," she replied. She handed him the letter. He read it in silence. His jaw tightened. "You think it's about your mother?" "I think it's about all of us." He paced for a moment, then turned back to her. "Then we go to the archives, now." The archives of House Thorne were kept in a sealed vault beneath their old estate. Olivia had only been there once, as a child, chasing Clara through the halls, never understanding why certain doors were always locked. Now, with the Grand Duke at her side, she returned with a key stolen from memory and a name that no longer begged for permission. They entered at dawn. Dust rose in clouds. Shelves groaned under the weight of ledgers, maps, correspondence. At first it was chaos, but Olivia had learned to find order in disorder. She began to scan for years, names, events. And then she found it. A ledger marked with a date 2 weeks before her mother's death. Inside were payments, dozens, to doctors, to housekeepers, and one to a woman named Leora. Her mother's name. Beside it, a note. Payment to be delayed until relocation is confirmed. Olivia's hand trembled. "Relocation?" she whispered. The Grand Duke scanned the next page. His eyes narrowed. Leora was going to leave. She wanted to take me with her. And they stopped her. Further down, a letter. "The Duquesa suspects too much. If Leora speaks to her, we lose control of the situation. Accelerate plans." And then, the final entry. "Estate transfer completed. Leora's death will not be questioned. The girl will remain under supervision." Silence. Then Olivia folded the letter, set it down carefully, and sat on the floor. "They let her die," she whispered. "And made it look like she never mattered." The Grand Duke knelt beside her. "You matter now." Olivia shook her head. "I always mattered. They just never wanted to see it." By noon, the documents were secured. By evening, the fire they tried to start in the archives was caught and extinguished, thanks to a watchman who had been paid in full by a mysterious benefactor. And by nightfall, the Queen received a sealed letter from Vikander Hall, with transcriptions, names, and a warning. If harm comes to Olivia again, what we uncovered will not remain silent. Love had not erased the past, but it had built a shield strong enough to face it. And for the first time in her life, Olivia knew. She was not someone to be pitied. She was not a burden. She was not a mistake. She was the consequence of other people's cruelty. And now, she would be their reckoning. The summons arrived before sunrise. Not a request, but a command, signed by the Queen's own seal. Olivia was to appear at the royal court by midday, not only as the Grand Duke's betrothed, but as the holder of documents now shaking the foundation of one of the kingdom's most powerful families. The Grand Duke watched her read the letter in silence. When she looked up, his eyes were steady. "You don't have to go alone," he said. But Olivia shook her head. "I do. This began with me. I wanted to end with me." He did not try to stop her. He only took her hand and kissed her knuckles, once, with the reverence of someone who understood the weight of history and still believed she could carry it. The throne room of the royal palace was cold, despite the summer sun outside. Dozens of nobles filled the gallery. Whispers clung to the high ceilings like smoke. Olivia walked in alone. No crown, no title, just a girl once forgotten. But she no longer moved like a shadow. She walked with the calm of someone who had survived worse than stares, someone who had stared into the furnace of betrayal and walked out the other side holding proof. The Queen sat on the throne, flanked by two senior advisors. Beside her stood the Crown Prince, face drawn with frustration. Further down, Olivia's father, the Duke, stared at her as if seeing a ghost. Edric sat behind him, arms crossed, eyes burning with resentment. Clara was not there. Olivia exhaled. "Lady Olivia Thorne," the Queen said, her voice smooth and sharp as silver. "You have brought claims of conspiracy, falsification of records, and obstruction of justice against your own family. These are grave charges." Olivia bowed her head slightly. "Yes, Your Majesty." The Queen gestured. "Speak." Olivia stepped forward and placed the sealed packet of evidence on a velvet-covered table. She did not speak of vengeance. She did not speak of bitterness. Instead, she told the truth. She spoke of her mother, how she had died under suspicious circumstances, and how House Thorne had taken her in only to discard her once she had outlived her usefulness. She spoke of the Duquesa, a kind woman who had tried to protect her, only to be silenced by circumstance and grief. She spoke of Clara, of a sister who had once braided her hair and now feared the shape of memory. She spoke of Edric, of the letters returned, the contempt masked as duty, the cruelty dressed in uniform. She read aloud the correspondence they had tried to burn. The room listened in silence. Then Olivia said the words that struck deeper than any accusation. "I don't bring these charges to punish," she said. "I bring them so no one else is ever buried beneath a name they didn't ask for. So no child has to wonder if their worth depends on the purity of their blood or the approval of their family. I loved this family," she added, voice steady. "But love without truth becomes silence, and silence is where cruelty hides." The Queen sat in stillness for a long moment. Then she turned to the Duke. "You have heard the claims. Do you deny them?" The Duke rose, slow and heavy. "I do not," he said at last. Gasps spread through the court. "I denied my daughter," he continued. "Not for justice, not for duty, but for cowardice. Because I thought love should follow bloodlines. Because I thought silence was safer than shame." He looked at Olivia then. "I am sorry," he said. "But I do not expect forgiveness." Olivia did not reply. Not because she had nothing to say, but because some wounds are acknowledged, not erased. The Queen passed sentence swiftly. House Thorne would relinquish 3 of their holdings to the Crown, provide restitution for falsified archives, and Edric would be barred from public office for 10 years. Clara, having aided the exposure, would be granted independence from her family's control. And Olivia would be named officially as a ward of the Crown until her marriage, and her lineage reinstated in the royal registry. It was not vengeance, but it was justice. And for Olivia, that was enough. Outside the palace, as the bells rang for noon, a carriage waited for her. The Grand Duke stood beside it, hands behind his back. When he saw her approach, his expression softened. "You did it," he said. Olivia looked up at the sky, a pale blue stretch above a kingdom that had once turned its face from her. "I told the truth," she said. That's all I ever wanted." He opened the door for her. "Come home then." She hesitated, then climbed in. And for the first time in her life, Olivia left the palace not as a shadow, but as a woman who had reclaimed her own name. The royal chapel had never held so many whispers. They filled the marble halls like incense, rising and curling beneath painted saints and solemn statues, whispers of disbelief, of judgment, of awe. The Grand Duke of Vikander was marrying the illegitimate daughter of House Thorne, not a foreign princess, not a daughter of the High Council, not a woman groomed for court life since birth. Olivia, the same girl once overlooked at banquets, who used to serve drinks to the nobles now craning their necks to see her. And she stood at the end of the aisle in a gown not woven of jewels or gilded threads, but soft ivory silk, with sleeves that shimmered like water and embroidery that whispered of wildflowers. No crown weighed her head, only a small comb nestled in her dark hair, the last gift her mother had left her before dying. The chapel bells tolled, the doors opened, and in he walked, the Grand Duke, dressed in full ceremonial uniform, medals catching the light like stars sewn into velvet. His expression was unreadable, carved from discipline and nobility. But the moment he saw Olivia at the end of the aisle, a quiet smile broke through. He looked at her as though he were a man arriving at the only place he'd ever meant to be. And Olivia? She couldn't breathe, not out of fear, but because for the first time in her life someone looked at her like she was not an obligation, not a tool, not a burden, but a choice. His choice. The vows were short, clear, but the moment that silenced the room, that branded itself into every witness's memory, was when the Grand Duke took her hand and said, "You've written to me in war, now let me be your peace." Olivia's eyes burned with tears. She whispered her promise back. "You saw me when no one else did. I'll never close my eyes again." Outside the chapel, the kingdom waited. Literally. Crowds had gathered behind golden gates, nobles spilling onto balconies, servants peeking from the upper floors. Children were hoisted onto shoulders, older women dabbed at their cheeks, because they had all heard the story now. The war hero and the forgotten girl. They had read it in letters, spoken it in bakeries, gasped over it in drawing rooms. They had whispered in mockery once. But now they waited in reverent silence. And when Olivia and the Grand Duke stepped into the sunlight hand in hand, a cheer rose, unpolished, real, echoing against the stone like thunder. Flower petals rained from above. A child shouted her name. Olivia blinked against the light. It no longer hurt her. Later, in the palace gardens, while musicians played a quiet waltz and dignitaries offered congratulations, Olivia stood beneath the blooming lilac trees and breathed in a world that no longer turned its back on her. She felt a gentle tug at her sleeve. Clara, pale and unsure but smiling. "I wore Mother's ribbon today," Clara whispered. "She would have liked you if she'd had more time." Olivia reached for her hand, and for the first time in years, the sisters stood side by side, not as strangers linked by blood, but as survivors bound by truth. When night fell, Olivia sat alone in her new chambers for a moment, staring at her reflection. She saw the same girl who had once written letters in the dark, with ink-stained fingers and hope that barely breathed. She saw the child who had flinched from praise, unsure if it would turn to punishment. She saw the woman who had walked through humiliation, betrayal, isolation, and still stood. The door creaked behind her. The Grand Duke entered, quiet and sure. "No title," he said softly, "can define you better than what you've already proven." "And what's that?" Olivia asked. "That you are your own miracle." Outside, the bells tolled once more, not for war, not for sorrow, but for a love that rewrote everything. A love chosen, not assigned, earned, not expected. And as they stood there together, two souls once scarred by silence, the kingdom realized this was no fairy tale. It was better. It was real. There was once a girl no one wanted, a girl born from silence, raised in shadows, blamed for death she didn't cause, punished for kindness she dared to offer. They tried to break her, to shrink her spirit into something small enough to forget. But love, true love, does not bloom in the safety of palaces or the approval of noble names. It grows in the cracks of pain, in the quiet resistance of a soul who chooses to endure. And Olivia? She endured. She grew. And she became. Not because someone rescued her, but because she refused to disappear. Now her name is written in the royal registry beside a Grand Duke, but more than that, it is written in the hearts of a kingdom that once turned its back on her and had to learn painfully and beautifully that worth cannot be bred, bought, or bestowed. It must be lived, and she lived it, with grace, with fire, with the soft defiance of a girl who wrote letters in the dark and ended up rewriting history. So tell me, if someone like Olivia can rise from ashes and rewrite her fate, what's still stopping you from rewriting yours?